Thank you, Kim. That was really powerful and beautiful. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley Winning, and I'm the Vice President of Research and Evaluation here at EMPath. It's my honor to introduce this first session of our public conference titled, What Works? Lessons from a Historic Decline in Child Poverty. Over the past quarter century, so about since 1993, the child poverty rate in the United States reduced by more than half. Our wonderful speakers here, Dana Thomson and Renee Ryberg, investigated the constellation of influences including economic, demographic, and policy forces that led to this remarkable decline, with the hope of helping policymakers sustain and accelerate that progress. And they're here to share their findings with us. Their study was the basis for the recent series of stories by Jason DeParle in the New York Times. So if you've been reading the newspapers, you know that they are a big deal, and this work is a really big deal. So let me tell you a little bit about these research celebrities. Dr. Dana Thomson is a research scientist at Child Trends who studies child poverty, policies, and practices that create more equitable access to economic mobility and conditions that support family resilience. She works to elevate the diversity of experiences among families who face economic hardship and other forms of adversity, and to identify and remove barriers and improve equitable access to effective policies, programs, and needed supports. Dana earned her PhD in Applied Developmental and Educational Psychology from Boston College. And Dr. Renee Ryberg is a research scientist in the education research, also at Child Trends. Trained as a sociologist and demographer, Dr. Ryberg's work aims to create equitable environments to help children and youth thrive throughout their education and into adulthood. Working at the intersection of poverty and education, she strives to dismantle the barriers that children and families with low incomes face in accessing education and navigating what lies beyond. Renee earned her PhD in sociology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So their full and impressive bios can be found on the conference website and on the app, on the Whova app. And the more I talk about them, the less they have time to say. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dana and Renee. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We are thrilled to be here. I'm going to take just a moment to pull up our slides. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It is such a privilege to be here to share with you some of the lessons that we have learned from our analysis of the decline in child poverty over the past quarter century. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that our work builds extensively on existing data and research. In particular, we want to thank the Census Bureau and Columbia University's Center on Poverty and Social Policy, who developed and made publicly available the data sets that made our analysis possible. We also explicitly build on the National Academy of Sciences roadmap to reducing child poverty, as well as important work by Dolores Acevedo Garcia, Regina Baker, Liana Fox, Hilary Hoynes, Marianne Page, Ann Huff Stevens, and Chris Weimer. So having enough money to cover basic needs, including food, housing, healthcare, and childcare, is essential for children's health and well-being. As many of you are aware, there's a wealth of evidence that shows that growing up in poverty impacts virtually every dimension of child development, from physical health to social and emotional development, to behavioral and educational outcomes, and eventual labor market success. Our school systems, our healthcare systems, our child welfare systems, our juvenile justice systems spend considerable resources to address the downstream costs of child poverty. Indeed, by some estimates, child poverty is costing the nation about $1 trillion a year. And for every dollar we spend preventing child poverty in the first place, we would have saved over 7 times as much on the back end. The absence of child poverty is one of the strongest markers of a healthy society, economically, and one could also argue morally. Yet child poverty has historically been seen as an intractable problem in the US. Child poverty rates would go up and down with economic cycles, but across cycles, they budged very little. However, over the past 25 years, our country has seen an astounding decline in child poverty. In this graph that we're looking at, we look at the rates of child poverty since 1967 using the anchored historical supplemental poverty measure. The light gray bars in the graph represent times of economic recession. And I want to draw your attention to the right-hand side of the graph where this decline happened. In 1993, more than 1 in 4 kids in the US lived in poverty. By 2019, roughly 1 in 10 kids were in poverty. This represents a decline of nearly 60%. And we actually see a similar decline for deep poverty, which is families living at less than half the poverty threshold or on less than about $15,000 a year for a family of 4. So as you can see, the right-hand side of this graph looks very different than the left-hand side. Not only is the extent of this decline unprecedented in the history of poverty measurement in the US, but it's also clear that something has shifted in the landscape of child poverty. And our team set out to understand the full constellation of influences that led to this decline. We did this in the hope that the lessons we learned along the way could help policymakers and practitioners be better able to sustain and accelerate the progress we've made. So we set out to answer the following questions. First, what led to the remarkable decline in child poverty? And specifically, we looked at 3 major factors that shape the landscape of child poverty: economic and labor market factors, demographic changes, and policy shifts. The second question we set out to answer was, did all groups of children experience a similar decline? And finally, we wanted to know for which children has the social safety net worked and who has it left behind? The overarching story of what we found is a remarkably positive one, but it's also a story with very important caveats. And we're going to explain in this presentation all of the good news as well as the work that's left to be done. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Renee to describe what we found.
Thanks, Dana. So we started out by looking at economic conditions and how they shape this decline in child poverty. We found that a healthy economy was an important contributor to the decline in child poverty, but alone, it was not sufficient. So in total, we looked at 5 different state-level economic factors. We looked at changes in unemployment rates, changes in single mothers' participation in the labor force, changes in state minimum wages, changes in median wages, and GDP. We found that 3 of these were associated with the decline in child poverty. In particular, lower unemployment rates or a tighter labor market explained about 18% of the decline in child poverty. More single mothers participating in the labor market explained about 9%, and higher state minimum wages explained about 7%. We also found growth in median wages and GDP. But while these may have benefited families at higher income levels, they did not translate into lower poverty rates. Together, the 3 economic factors that we found to be important, lower unemployment rates, more single moms in the labor force, and higher state minimum wages, explained about 1/3 of the decline in child poverty and about 40% of the decline in deep child poverty. But that means there's still a lot left to be explained. So next, we looked at demographic shifts. As a whole, demographic changes did not contribute to the decline in poverty, but they were associated with the decline in deep poverty, and in a pretty big way. So I just said that demographic shifts were not associated with the decline in child poverty, but I want to pause and explain why, because there are some important lessons here. There were actually a couple of demographic factors that did make a small contribution, and these are shown on the left-hand side of the screen. Namely, small increases in the share of children living in 2-parent families and small decreases in the share of Black children whose families face workplace and other forms of discrimination were associated with small declines in child poverty. But at the same time, there are factors working in the opposite direction. Factors, all else being equal, that would have increased child poverty rates. Specifically, increases in the share of children in Hispanic families and children in immigrant families who face discrimination both in accessing full benefits of the labor market and accessing the social safety net, as we'll see in a few minutes, were associated with increases in child poverty. And these countervailing factors overpowered the demographic factors leading to declines in child poverty. So this led us to believe that if it weren't for the systemic barriers that increasing shares of our population are facing, child poverty rates would have declined even more. So that was the story for poverty. If we look at deep poverty, we see a different story. And here I'll focus on the differences. So first, changes in the share of Black and Hispanic children were not associated with the decline in deep child poverty. However, as we see on the right, increases in the share of children in immigrant families were associated with deep poverty rates. So again, we see that systemic barriers are prohibiting child poverty from declining even more. But then focusing on the left side of the screen, there was an additional factor here that was importantly linked with the declines in deep child poverty. Over the past 25 years, there's been a large decline in teen birth rates across the country. Teen birth rates have declined by almost 3/4. And the relationship between teen birth rates and child poverty is complicated, multi-directional. What we found was that this decline was associated with just over half of the decline in deep child poverty. So we've looked at economic factors, we've looked at demographic shifts, and now I'm going to focus on the social safety net. If we think broadly about the social safety net, we've seen large growth in its role protecting kids from living in poverty over the past 25 years. And that growth in particular was responsible for much of the decline in child poverty. And this graph illustrates that growth. So the blue line is the actual child poverty rate as measured by the supplemental poverty measure. The purple line on top is a counterfactual rate. It's what child poverty rates would have been without the social safety net. You can think of the gap between these two lines as the role that the social safety net played in reducing child poverty. So in 1993, these two lines were fairly close together, and the social safety net played a moderate role in reducing child poverty. In 1993, the social safety net reduced child poverty rates by 9%, protecting about 2 million kids from living in poverty. By 2019, the role of the social safety net grew. These lines are now further apart. In 2019, the social safety net lowered child poverty by 44%, nearly half, and protected 6.5 million children from poverty. So between 1993 and 2019, the number of children protected from living in poverty by the social safety net more than tripled. And let's dive into the social safety net a little bit. The programs that we examined as part of the social safety net are listed here along the x-axis. It's a patchwork of programs that include refundable tax credits, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is all the way on the left. It includes in-kind supports, such as SNAP and housing assistance, as well as cash assistance through TANF. The dark blue bars show the poverty reduction role of each program in 1993, and the light blue bars show their role in 2019. You can see here that the composition of the social safety net changed pretty dramatically over the past 25 years. We saw growth almost across the board, with taller light blue bars showing a larger role of these programs in reducing poverty in 2019 than in 1993. The exception to this is TANF. TANF was previously considered to be a critical cash assistance program for families who were out of work or unable to work, but its role has diminished substantially over time. Meanwhile, the role of the EITC, which is conditional on work, has greatly grown over time. All right, so we just saw that the social safety net's role in reducing child poverty over the last 25 years grew considerably. Over the same time period, though, the social safety net there's been little progress made in strengthening the social safety net for children with the least resources, particularly those in deep poverty. So if we look at this graph for deep poverty, we see a pretty different story. Again, the blue line are actual deep child poverty rates, and the purple line are what poverty rates would have been without the social safety net. The space between these two lines is huge. The social safety net has consistently played an important role in protecting kids from living in deep poverty. In 1993, the social safety net reduced child deep poverty rates by 62%, and this was a similar poverty reduction of 66% in 2019. So while the social safety net has consistently been an important factor protecting kids from living in deep poverty, its role has not grown over time. This is in stark contrast to what we just saw for child poverty in general. Because its role has not grown over time, the social safety net was not a major contributor to the decline in deep poverty rates over time. The composition, though, also changed when we think about the social safety net with respect to protecting kids against deep poverty. The main change here, again, has to do with the AFDC and TANF. In 1993, AFDC was the single largest program protecting the most children from living in deep poverty. It's that tall blue bar that stands out against the rest. Now, it's a pretty minor factor. We did see, though, some growth in other programs to help make up this gap left by TANF. Social Security, in particular, saw the largest increase in its deep poverty protection role. In 2019, Social Security was the greatest contributor to reductions in deep child poverty, followed by SNAP. All right, we're going to shift gears now to answer our second question, which was, did all groups of children experience a similar decline in poverty? And what we found here was remarkable, part of the success story that Dana teed up. Between 1993 and 2019, child poverty rates declined at similar rates for nearly all subgroups of children. Whether we look by family immigration status, by child race and ethnicity, or by family structure, we see remarkably consistent declines in child poverty. That's the good news. The caveat here is that it's disparities that existed in 1993 persisted through this period. And this graph illustrates those disparities. In 1993, children in immigrant families were about 1.7 times as likely to live in poverty as children in non-immigrant families. Asian, Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander children were about 1.5 times as likely to live in poverty as their white peers. And Black children, Hispanic children, and children in single-parent families were nearly 3 times as likely to live in poverty as their peers. If we fast forward to 2019, we see nearly identical disparities by family immigration status, by child race and ethnicity, and by family structure. So despite this historic decline in child poverty, disparities in who is likely to experience that poverty have not budged. All right. And to answer our third research question, we looked at how well the social safety net is working for different groups of children. We found that the role of the social safety net grew for nearly every subgroup of children, but it does not work equally well for everyone. In particular, the social safety net tends to work better for children in non-immigrant families than for children in immigrant families. It tends to work better for Black and white children than for Asian, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander children and for Hispanic children. And it tends to work better for children who have stably employed parents than for children who do not have a stably employed parent. You may notice that many of the groups on the right for whom the social safety net works less well are the same groups of children who are at elevated risks of living in poverty. The social safety net actually makes existing disparities in child poverty worse by family immigration status, for some racial and ethnic groups, and by parental employment stability. Let me say that again. Our existing social safety net exacerbates existing disparities in who experiences child poverty. All right, so to summarize, What we found in this historic reduction in child poverty is a remarkable success story. Millions fewer children live in poverty today than a generation ago. But it's also a story with very important caveats. Our findings lead us to believe that child poverty is solvable with concerted effort. We know that both a strong economy and a strong social safety net are important here. We're also encouraged to find evidence that public policies can and do make a difference in the lives of children. We know a lot about what works and what does not. But our nation's work to protect children from poverty, as you all know, is not over. Millions of children still grow up in poverty. And we found that existing policies affect children in different situations with varying degrees of success, in some cases making existing disparities worse. So to continue the success story and help to eliminate the caveats, Dana will now present our 5 policy and practice recommendations based on our evidence. These are aimed at improving our social safety net and support systems for children in poverty, promoting economic mobility, as well as addressing equity gaps in human services and the broader root causes of poverty.
Thank you so much, Renee. As I go through our recommendations, I'm going to try and give a high-level recommendation, and then I'm also going to try to provide some really concrete examples of how each recommendation can be applied to policy or to practice. So our first recommendation is that we recraft social safety net programs as well as other types of supports to prioritize child needs. One important way to do this is by determining eligibility for programs based on child needs rather than parental characteristics, such as work status or immigration status. The expanded child tax credit is a really nice example of how policies and programs can be designed in a way that they prioritize child needs. And I'll highlight 4 key ways in which it accomplished this. First, it based eligibility on children's legal status in the US, for example, whether a child has a social security number, rather than parental legal status. This meant that the expanded CTC, the child tax credit, had the potential to reach approximately 4 million US citizen children of ITIN holders who currently are ineligible for a number of other types of programs, such as the EITC. The expanded child tax credit also did not base eligibility on parental work status or minimum earnings, which meant that it had the potential to reach the 23 million children who were previously excluded because their families did not have stable employment or earned too little to qualify. This is especially important in the context of extensive research indicating that children in deep poverty are at higher risk of experiencing among the worst outcomes. Young children are also particularly vulnerable to the effects of poverty, and the expanded CTC incorporated this developmental perspective into its design by providing higher benefits for children under age 6. And finally, the expanded CTC paid benefits out in monthly rather than annual installments, which helped to provide economic stability in children's resources throughout the year. And these same principles can be applied to local initiatives as well. Our second recommendation is that administrative burdens to the social safety net, and again to other types of support programs more generally, should be eased. We suggest that easing administrative burdens will help reduce child poverty by making programs easier to access, and these changes may be particularly helpful in mitigating the persistent disparities we still see between subgroups of children, because we know that administrative burdens themselves are not distributed equally. The classic example of administrative burden is all of the red tape associated with accessing social safety net programs. So social safety net programs can have complex rules, lengthy application and documentation processes, and requirements for in-person interviews during work hours. but there are ways that we can improve the design and implementation of programs to reduce the burden on families, including having a common application system or allowing families to be categorically eligible for additional programs once they have been deemed eligible for others with similar criteria. But there are ways to reduce administrative burden beyond the policies themselves, and that happens when organizations help to take on some of the burden borne by individual families. A nice example of this is a Boston-based program called Street Cred. Street Cred increases awareness of and participation in one of our country's largest anti-poverty tools, the Earned Income Tax Credit. And it does this by embedding free tax preparation services within pediatric clinics. This reduces administrative burden because trusted providers are connecting one-on-one with families to talk with them directly about their eligibility for refundable tax credits like the EITC. But Street Cred doesn't just provide information and increase awareness. It actually brings these services directly to families in a location that they visit regularly. Free tax preparers are embedded right there in the clinic to help families do their taxes while they're waiting for their doctor appointment. Street Cred also works with state and community partners to provide what they call bundled services to help families address multiple needs at once. It's like one-stop shopping. Families are connected with a variety of state and community-based supports for promoting economic mobility, all in one place. And finally, Street Cred works directly with the low-income communities of color that they serve to better understand the specific barriers families are facing, and then they tailor their services accordingly. And once again, these principles can be applied to a variety of different types of programs and settings, including, for example, early care and education settings, which is another trusted and frequented location by families with children. Our third recommendation is that we need policies and programs that support stable employment and more robust female labor force participation. From a policy perspective, this can take the shape of promoting fair labor markets, raising minimum wages, and, very importantly, ensuring that childcare is affordable and accessible. In other words, we need to make work work as a sustainable way for parents to support their children. While we just highlighted a handful of policies that can help to support stable employment among parents, community-based programs also play an important role, particularly in addressing the barriers to stable employment. Before I share an example, however, I want to note that Renee mentioned poverty rates declined at very similar rates among nearly all subgroups of children that we examined, but there was one exception. Children with stably employed parents experienced considerable declines in their poverty and deep poverty rates over the past 25 years. The poverty rate of children with stably employed parents declined by 61%, and their deep poverty rate declined by a remarkable 69%. However, children without stably employed parents experienced very little progress. Poverty rates for this group declined by only 28%, and deep poverty rates did not decline at all. As our social safety net shifted from out of work to in-work assistance, it unfortunately did little to address the significant barriers to stable employment that some parents face. Challenges to finding and maintaining secure employment can include mismatches between skills and available jobs, limited job networks or resources, lack of access to affordable childcare or transportation, chronic health issues, and lack of accommodations in the workplace, and the many forms of discrimination that certain job seekers face. Career pathways models like Year Up and EMPath's mobility mentoring are specifically designed to address these barriers. They support families in setting their own career and economic mobility goals, in connecting parents with job training and educational opportunities, in providing business attire and logistical support, in offering coaching and soft skills, and in helping with childcare, transportation, food assistance, medical insurance, and meeting basic needs. This type of individualized, relationship-based coaching is critical for helping parents navigate the unique challenges they experience to accessing job markets, and particularly higher quality jobs that can actually support their families, provide needed benefits, and provide opportunities for advancement. Our fourth recommendation builds off of our finding that declines in teen birth rates were associated with a large share of the reduction in deep poverty. We therefore recommend strategies to maintain these low teen birth rates by increasing investment in evidence-based teen pregnancy prevention strategies and safeguarding adolescents' access to contraception and safe abortion, the latter of which was endangered by the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court earlier this year. And while I don't give examples of specific programming here, there are a number of critical ingredients to consider. First is increasing knowledge of reproductive and sexual health. Second is increasing access to comprehensive, respectful, and integrated health care. That includes sexual and reproductive health and contraception as part of a larger focus on health and well-being. And third is making sure that youth have access to economic and social supports early in the life course that can help provide them with the opportunity and agency to meet their life goals. And our fifth and final recommendation is based on our finding around two-parent families. We recommend promoting the economic, social, and caregiving benefits that families, including extended families, bring to children and their parents. Such benefits include not just economic resources, but also logistical, emotional, and caregiving support. Policies that support families, such as family leave and flexible work scheduling, can provide adults with greater opportunities and resources to support the children in their lives. We also need to intentionally design policies and programs to be inclusive of fathers. Massachusetts Paid Family and Medical Leave Act, for example, covers a range of caregiving needs, including not just leave for pregnancy and childbirth, but also leave time for bonding with your child, which is intentionally inclusive of fathers and partners. Other types of programs and policies should consider how they may be able to tweak language, criteria, and programming to be more inclusive and mindful of the important role that fathers, partners, and extended family play in children's lives. So we started our presentation with a story of success. Over the course of a generation, this country has seen an astounding decline in child poverty. There is, however, still more work to be done. Nearly 4 million children continue to live in families below the poverty threshold, and millions more, while not statistically poor, continue to experience substantial economic hardship. We have shared some of the lessons we learned from our analysis about what works to reduce child poverty and how these lessons can be translated into policy and practice. Now, as we conclude, we'd like to highlight again the most critical areas for continuing our work to reduce child poverty. These have been mentioned previously in our presentation, but I want to specifically call them out as we think about the work that's collectively left to be done. First, we need to address the root structural causes of the persistent disparities in child poverty across race, ethnicity, and parental immigration status in our country. Second, we need to ensure that children with the least resources are not left behind. And third, we need to reduce the barriers to stable employment that many families continue to experience, and we need to ensure that stable employment is sufficient for families to support their children. This work that's left to be done, addressing the root causes of disparities and addressing the really complex constellation of barriers to stable employment for those experiencing deep poverty, is the hard work. This work is not just about ensuring that we have a strong and equitable social safety net. That is important. But the work that's left to be done requires a much more intensive, relationship-based, holistic, tailored types of supports that we highlighted in many of the examples that we just presented. This is the work that many of you do, and we look forward to hearing more about it in the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that fabulous presentation, sharing an overview of the important finding and then also going into the subgroups and sort of differential impacts. And I really appreciate you offering not just ideas for solutions like reducing administrative burden, but then also how can you do those? And not just this would help, but how, some concrete examples. We have a few questions that have come in on the Whova app already, but I would like to welcome everyone to raise your hand if you have a question, and we have mics, people with mics on the side who can, you can ask your questions on your own as well. So I don't see any hands, so I'm going to go to the app for now to warm you up. One person asked, what might the role of the recent limitations, actually you sort of addressed this later in your presentation, but what might the role of the recent limitations to women's access to reproductive care impact the gains in child poverty rates? And do you anticipate that the research community will study these issues to explain any further changes in child poverty in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. We did not study specifically the role of access to abortion on child poverty rates. So I want to be clear about that. But as Renee said, we did see over the last quarter century an enormous decline in teen birth rates. It dropped by 72%, yes. And we did see a strong association between that decline in teen birth rates and the decline in child poverty. And we do want to recognize that that relationship is very complex. As Renee said, it's multi-directional. So it can be the case that growing up in poverty can lead to increased teen birth rates as well as a decline in teen birth rates leading to a decline in child poverty. So in terms of the recent Dobbs decision, I think based on the findings that we saw in terms of this strong association with deep poverty in particular, I think we need to continue to maintain access to safe abortion and also to, as I said, ensure that teens are receiving comprehensive health care that includes access to contraception as well as sexual and reproductive health.
Great. Oh, there's a hand. That's good.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this information. You talked a lot about the social safety net and how it leaves behind children in immigrant families as well as children in Latino families. Can you give some examples of how that is exemplified, please?
Sure, I can give some examples. This is drawing heavily from Dolores's work, who you'll hear from next, but one of the most kind of egregious structural examples is with the EITC. So for a family to benefit from the EITC, all family members on the taxes must have a social security number. So if a child is a US-born citizen, has parents in the US legally, but they're working under an I-10 rather than a social security number, they don't get any benefits from the EITC, which is the largest program lifting kids out of poverty as of 2019. So it's structural. There are also administrative burdens that are particularly relevant for immigrant families. So for example, not being able to access information about programs or applications in a language other than English can be an additional barrier faced by that community.
Oh, I think you already answered my question, but I'll ask kind of from what your answer. Can you hear me okay? So you talked a little bit about the, I was really interested, you talked about the social safety network, and I think you spoke about the TANF, the temporary access to needy families, and the decline. Can you talk a little bit about why there was a decline? I don't know if, once again, if you kind of answered that with the EITC, if that is a reason why, but can you really touch upon that? Because I'm really intrigued to know about that.
Sure. So TANF is, or in 1993, it was AFDC, and it was the largest cash transfer program that supported families in poverty. So a number of things happened. So we saw kind of a policy shift during the 1990s that essentially favored in-work assistance. So programs in which families were working, in which parents were working. So the EITC is an example of that. We saw a huge expansion of the EITC in the early 1990s, and the EITC is, as Renee said, conditional on work. So it requires that you have an income in order to qualify. At the same time, TANF, which is what AFDC became in 1996, also instituted work requirements. So it was no longer an out-of-work cash assistance program. It also required participants to work or be looking for work. And I think there's some additional kind of policy nuances in the sense of Congress decided rather than having funding for the program increase with inflation, it would just be a flat rate. So they've essentially allowed funding for the program to decline over the year in real terms. That's right.
One other note about TANF is we only looked at the role of direct cash assistance, but states have a lot of flexibility in how they spend their TANF dollars. So only a small percentage of funds are going towards direct cash assistance. Other parts of TANF funding go to things like childcare subsidies or sometimes state EITCs, things like that. So we only looked at the direct cash assistance.
So first of all, thank you so much for such a in-depth, comprehensive approach to this work. This assists us when we go back as we prepare for budget testimony, so thank you. Secondly, we will be trying to get this testimony, this presentation. So secondly, my question is this. You talk about disparities from Black and brown, right? And we call it out all the time. You say we need to study it more. What exactly, if you had to pick two things that we need to look at and we say we need to study it more, what are two things that you would say we need to really look at so that we can, at least be on the trajectory of addressing it versus just calling it out?
Great question. That's absolutely where we need to move as a research community. We know what the disparities are. The question is, what do we do about them? So for me, I'm curious about your answer, Dana. I would say we need to look at two things. One is the explicit encoded policies that make it harder for families of color to access programs. Those on the federal side tend to be around immigration status. It's the immigration discrimination that's driving the disparities for Asian families and Hispanic families in particular. That's one. The other would be looking at how programs are administered on the ground. What are the more informal practices that lead to families being treated differently? How much discretion do individual frontline workers have in making decisions, and how does that lead to bias creeping into practices?
I completely agree with both of those answers. I will add that there has been some really good work out there that has looked at, so I think TANF in particular is administered at the state level, and so states are making decisions. And so there's differences across states in the generosity of those TANF benefits. And some really important work has been done by other researchers that have looked at states with high proportions of populations of color are actually, the states themselves have less generous benefits. So I think that's just a really stark example of exactly what Renee was just talking about. There are the policies themselves are built over a long period of time by multiple administrations, and sometimes we've forgotten how they originated, but they have originated from very racist origins, and so I think that's one aspect of it, and the other aspect is thinking about, you know, how things are different across states, how those decisions are being made, and there's been some interesting work on even how the program administrators are interacting with folks on the ground in terms, and making decisions about, does this actually meet this guideline or not? And then I'll add a third. So that's all to Renee's two great points. The third is I think we really need to talk, you know, do the on-the-ground work with families and understand how they are experiencing poverty and the barriers that they are experiencing in terms of accessing economic mobility opportunities. So that's not just income and access to jobs, it's also wealth building opportunities. So there's a lot of work to be done at the community level as well.
Yes, I found it interesting that you guys, one of your suggestions was focusing on the child's characteristics as opposed to the parents. And we talk about deep poverty. If my understanding is correct, deep poverty is when you're 50% below the poverty level, as opposed to being low income, which is 200% above the poverty level. But all of that's based on the parent's income. So how do we do that? What does it look like in practice to focus on the children as opposed to the adults?
Right, so children are living in these families with those poverty levels. So the parent's income is certainly, you know, creating the environment in which children have the resources or opportunities to engage in our society. I think when we talk about focusing on child needs, it's really about designing our policies and our programs to be focused on children. So rather it's, I think the income piece of it is actually a critical ingredient where it's the family income, and I think we need to acknowledge that. When we think, though, about who should qualify for a program, rather than focusing on, are these parents working? Do they deserve aid? We should be focusing on, are these children thriving, and do they have what they need to develop healthily, if that's a word.
Hello. Your data goes through 2019, and I'm interested to know if you or other researchers are planning to look at how the data may shift as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, so literally one day after we released our study, the Census Bureau came out with their new numbers for 2021. And they did some nice analysis looking at the role of the expanded child tax credit in 2021 and the role of the stimulus payments in 2020. And so the decline in child poverty continued through the pandemic and accelerated through the pandemic because of those intentional federal interventions. So child poverty rates were cut in half again between 2019 and 2021. So we're now at record lows of 5.2%. And the largest contributing factors to those were those intentional efforts on the part of the federal government, the stimulus checks in particular in 2020 and the expanded child tax credit in 2021.
I will add that the expanded child tax credit is now expired, and we are seeing record rates of inflation. And so families are again having a really hard time struggling to make ends meet. I think another important thing to kind of consider as we think about poverty is that when we measure poverty for the purpose of this analysis, we're looking at an annual income, but that's not always how supports or income comes to families. Sometimes income for families is sporadic through the year, and a lot of the benefits like the child tax credit, well, the child tax credit was paid monthly, but other benefits like the EITC come annually. And so even though we've seen a reduction in child poverty as we've had all of these great government programs, that doesn't necessarily mean that families are not experiencing hardship. So we actually saw an increase in food insecurity during the pandemic, even as we saw this decline in child poverty. So it's just important to kind of think about these child poverty statistics as we think about other measures of child well-being and even just the families that we work with day in, day out.
And that ties right into the last question about what does it mean to focus on child needs. If a child is in a family that is technically above the poverty line but experiencing food insecurity because the payments come all in one chunk at one point in the year, that's not meeting child needs.
A question from our table. For the families that we serve, how do you suggest that we kind of work with our private industries to partner with us for job trainings and to move our families into better jobs in their organizations?
I think, I'm not entirely sure, but I think actually that might be this subject of some of the upcoming presentations. I think one of the things that has struck me as I've been engaged in this work is that, as we're trying to help families access the job market, that's one goal, and it's an important goal. But actually helping families access what we might call good jobs, so jobs that are actually paying wages that can help families support their children, jobs that allow for opportunities for advancement, and jobs that provide benefits, including paid family leave, including health insurance. I think that's a really critical factor of how we help families not just move over the poverty line, but build their economic mobility on an ongoing basis.
This also reminds me of some innovative work going on in Oklahoma, where they're creating what Dana called one-stop shops, where there's access to basic needs supports at job training programs. So just like children can't learn when they're hungry, a parent's going to struggle to work if their basic needs are not met, if they don't have a reliable place to sleep. And so embedding some of those services at the same location is a strategy that they're trying in Oklahoma and their Hope Centers to try to get some synergies between the different supports.
All right, we're at time. There were a number of questions on the Whova app that we can try to address. You might be able even to type in some answers. And also there's a bit of a break now, so if you want to come up and speak with the speakers or get coffee or ask a neighbor at your table your question if it wasn't answered here today, or share kind of one piece that you learned from this that you could take back to your work and grapple with in these next 15 minutes. And then we'll meet back here at 2 o'clock for Raj Chetty and Dolores Acevedo Garcia's presentation. Thanks again to our wonderful speakers for that presentation.